So, this morning, are you good for some deep theology? Yeah, there we go. So, ever since the 7th of October, when Hamas attacked Israel, and the same day Israel declared war on Hamas, and we have seen that unfold over the last 6 weeks or so, and all that has meant. And a couple of weeks ago, we looked at just to try and get a grip of the background to this in the Middle East. And if you missed that, I think it was on the 23rd, 22nd of October. You can go and download that message. It kind of gives you all the background. And I'd encourage you to listen to that, just to help you get perspective. But one of the things that I've noticed in the weeks that have followed is there's been a whole lot of, as it happens whenever there's some flare-up in the Middle East, there's a whole lot of prophecies and connections and that kind of thing, largely from Christian leaders and so on out the States, about how this is all happening in the end times and this is supposed to happen, and they quote all these scriptures and can sound, of course, very compelling, and we go, oh, I didn't know that, and so on. How close then are we to the end? In fact, in the secular media, and I was quite surprised to see this, maybe not so surprised, but there's talk now of potentially World War III, because obviously in the days after Israel declared war, the U.S. sent a carrier group. Now, a carrier group is a massive armada of ships into the Mediterranean, right off Israel's coast, just kind of as a show of force, like we're with Israel. You attack Israel, and we will mess with you. And so obviously then, as you've heard, if these things escalate, if Lebanon gets drawn into the war and so on, what could happen? And so there is a whole lot of, perhaps one might say, fear-mongering on one hand, maybe just kind of looking at it as it is and going, what is going on? And so I thought maybe we need to bring some clarity into the situation. Maybe we just need to speak to that today, because particularly from a Christian point of view, from a faith point of view, whenever there's a flare-up in the Middle East, there are always these prophecies and all these guys connecting the dots. You see Gog and Magog, Iran and Russia, and they've linked to the Sudan, and they're going to come against Israel, and so on. And it's not for the first time that we've been down this road. Just saying. Probably for the last good few decades, going back to I don't know how long, but certainly as long as I've been alive and a bit longer, every time something happened in the Middle East, there were all these predictions of what was going to happen. What was going to happen? Do you remember back in the 1970s, 1980s that Jesus was going to come by 1998? He had to come by 1988, because that was the generation. 40 years from the establishment of the nation of Israel, 40 years, the generation Jesus spoke of. In 1988, Jesus had to come. Yeah. Oops. We're still here. That was very compelling. They connected all the dots for us. They connected all the dots. It was all very compelling. And then ever since, every time there's something happening, do you remember the blood moons? Remember the blood moons? What was it, about 2014? John Hagee, the blood moons are going to line up over Israel. Yeah, we got burnt with that one, didn't we? We're still here. It's a risky business. All these predictions and so on. But people still, every time you've seen it. I was listening the other day. I listened to a few. Man, I could not believe how people can butcher the text. And I mean butcher the text. It's not saying that. One particular, you'll find Gaza referenced in the Bible. There also Hamas is referenced in the Bible. It's a Hebrew word. It's not the word that Hamas are using. They're using the Aramaic word. And so on. So see, it's in the Bible. It's not referring to Hamas, the political party. It's just not. And when Gaza is mentioned in the Bible, some preacher, well-known guy actually, I won't mention his name, well-known guy, Gaza, from something in Isaiah, Gaza, you see, that's judgment in Gaza. To justify the Israelis' actions at the moment based on that scripture is an horrendous abuse of the text. It's not what it's talking about. It's not what it's talking about. We're not going to get into all of that. We're going to look at what the Bible does say, because that always leads us to freedom and truth. So we're going to look at Matthew 24, because this is one of the misquoted scriptures, misunderstood scriptures, and I'll show you how. We're going to look at Matthew 24, the lips of Jesus, from the lips of Jesus, his teaching on what would happen, both in the end times and what was going to happen shortly after his time. And hopefully then we can get some perspective. We can get some perspective on this whole thing, biblical perspective, the kind of perspective Jesus would want, because it's in answer to his disciples' question, which is the same kind of question we would have, and how that gives us then a perspective to move through these days without getting caught up in all the fear-mongering, without losing our faith, without kind of following teachings that actually don't help, and the like. So we're going to look at that. And before we do that, let me just say that it's important to understand that Matthew 24 into Matthew 25 actually follows a theme of judgment. It's not primarily about connecting dots in the end times. It is actually a theme of judgment. And it starts, this is Jesus' last week. And in chapter 22 and 23, Jesus lays into the Pharisees. It was the one time that he went after the Pharisees and just exposed their hypocrisy and their sin for what it was. And that ends at the end of chapter 23. He talks about Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Oh, I had longed to gather you. As a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not listen. You would not have any of it. And then he speaks to the temple and he says, this place will be laid desolate. That's what he says. Now, part of that was going to be fulfilled in him. Remember? So when Jesus died, what happened? The temple curtain was torn in two because man was no longer separated from God. And what that did, in fact, mean was that the temple, the cornerstone of Jewish worship, became obsolete in that moment. Because the Messiah had come. The writer to the Hebrews says, there can be no further sacrifice. There can be no further sacrifice because the sacrifice has been offered once and for all. So Jesus speaks of that and he essentially prophesies about that. And then we read in Matthew 24. We're going to read the whole chapter because it's going to give you the context. And then we're just going to work through the chapter and I'll explain it to you. Not me, but as the majority of Christians have understood this, for 1900 years before some funny end-time theology kind of crept in, that took this passage to mean a whole different thing. So, let's read it together, and then we'll go through it in more detail. Holding for time. Good. From verse 1, Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples. When his disciples came up to him to call his attention to these buildings, the temple. Do you see all these things, he said? He asked. I tell you the truth, that not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Okay, that's what we were all asking. What will be the signs? What's going to happen? And this is Jesus' reply. Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. And then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, you will turn away from the faith, and many will turn away from the faith, and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place, in the temple, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will take place in the winter, not take place in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. In those days, had they not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east, is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, the vultures will gather. You see, it's like just like phrase after phrase after phrase. I'm not going to unpack everything, but we'll get the gist of it. Where are we? Immediately after the stress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as the twigs get tender and its leaves come out, then you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth. This is the critical verse. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Verse 36. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, 1 will be taken and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at the hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful servant and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants of his household to give them food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I'll tell you the truth, he will put in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And then he begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he is not aware of it. And he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So I told you it's a passage about judgment. It's not, oh, happy day. All right, shall we unpack this? All right. Are you with me? So far, so good. We haven't even got started yet. All right, so what is important to understand in a passage like Matthew 24, as with Daniel, the passage in Daniel, is that often in prophecy, it's layered, meaning that there is an imminent situation that is being spoken to as a foreshadowing of something that will happen down the line, okay? So when Daniel spoke his prophecy, he was speaking of things that would happen when the Israelites returned back to their homeland. And we'll get to that later on. And then there were certain things that were going to happen after the temple had been rebuilt. And then there is, as a foreshadowing then, of things that may happen at the end of days. And similarly in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking at 2 levels, because he's actually answering 2 separate questions from his disciples. His disciples ask him in verse 3, tell us, when will this happen? So Jesus had just spoken of the desolation of the temple. He just spoke of the desolation of the temple. They're looking at the temple. And they come to him and they say, when will this happen? And then they follow it up with another question, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Now, it's important to understand that when the disciples asked those 2 questions, to us, they looked like 2 separate questions. But to the minds of the disciples and those that lived in the very early days following Jesus' life and death, lived believing that Jesus would come in their lifetime. You need to understand that. So that's why Paul writes to the Thessalonians, the Christians in Thessalonica had quit their jobs. They were up on the hills around Thessalonica waiting for Jesus' return. They genuinely believed that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. So it is very possible that the disciples are asking what sounds to us like two separate questions, but in fact, in their minds, they were one, two parts of the same question. When will these things take place, and what will be the signs of your coming? In other words, they anticipated what Jesus was going to talk about, and the destruction of the temple would coincide then with his coming. That made sense. It made sense to them. But they're actually two separate questions. We know that there are two, and they're two separate answers because we know one has happened and the one is still to come. Does that make sense? So Jesus answers those two questions in one long response, divided by that key little verse in verse 34, where Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things have been fulfilled. In other words, what is Jesus talking about? Everything that he's just said, from the time he starts to answer their question in verse 4, right through to verse 34. All of that, Jesus is talking about, that would be fulfilled at the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, 40 years from when Jesus was crucified. Does it make sense? Now, here's the problem. And I don't know why guys don't do this. I've tried to look and get into the background. But there are those that come in there and they see that generation. Not all argue this, but some argue that what Jesus meant by that generation was the establishment of Israel in 1948 up to 1988. Now, that argument obviously falls away because we're still here. But somehow they don't see that generation. Nobody debates the 40-year generation, but nobody. But somehow they kind of look at everything in Matthew 24 as futuristic. So I was listening to a guy just the other day, a Messianic Jew. And he's going, yeah, you see, the temple has to be rebuilt because it talks there in verse 15. It talks there about the abomination that causes desolation standing in the temple. You see, there has to be a rebuilt temple, and there has to be some Antichrist figure that's going to stand in that temple, make a treaty with Israel, and then break that treaty. So the problem then is, how does that all fit together if it's entirely futuristic? What was Jesus referring to then? If you push it entirely into the future, there is no temple. There is no clear teaching in the New Testament that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Why? Well, it's very obvious. Jesus was the fulfillment. Jesus was the fulfillment. When Jesus died and the temple curtain was torn once and for all, the sacrifice had been made. There is no need. There is no need for any temple. The reason why there's all this thing about the temple is because in order to fit into a futuristic grid, they have to see a temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. But it doesn't actually hold. There's the temple referred to in Ezekiel chapter 40, which is what they go to. Ezekiel chapter 40 is talking about, and this is often where the futurist prophets get it mixed up, is talking about the return from exile. They talk about the return from the Jews that we have seen witnessed in like around 1948 in this last century. So instead of seeing the return of the Jews who came back under Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the temple under Nehemiah, it's seen as something futuristic. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up theologically, because why would there need to be a third temple when Jesus came to be the fulfillment of that temple? And says now, the New Testament teaching, you are the temple. Your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So understand the reason why they argue that there's a temple, then is based on that. But the clear teaching of those prophets, Ezekiel was a prophet in exile. Clearly he was speaking of the temple to come. And even there, in Ezekiel 47, I think it talks about the river that flows from the temple. So there's this, the immediate prophecy will be the fulfillment of the temple rebuilt, but a foreshadowing of the great, glorious, heavenly temple from which the river of life will flow. So there's an immediate fulfillment, and then there is a more distant. It's really important to understand that. Otherwise, everything kind of falls down. So then, if you're going to hold to a futuristic view, then everything that happened, the rumors of wars and earthquakes, and you'll get guys that will tell you, you know what, in the 20th century, there were 2 world wars and more wars than the previous 19 centuries, more earthquakes. Jesus says, that's actually irrelevant. He said it there, don't look at those things. Don't look at those things. There have always been earthquakes. There have always been wars. Nations have gone against each other. You'll be persecuted because of me. The persecution that came first for the Christians wasn't from the Romans. That came later. It was from the Jews. From the Jews. How did Stephen die? Stephen didn't die at the hand of the Romans. He died at the hand of Saul, who, praise God, got saved and became Paul. So all these things. But then, admittedly, it does get a little complicated because it talks about, the sun will be darkened and the moon, etc. It gets very complicated if you hold to it an entirely futuristic view. Jesus was answering 2 questions. The one question the disciples asked, when will this happen? And Jesus had spoken about the desolation that happened in the temple. That was their first question. Jesus answers that. He says, all these things will take place. And so these signs that are all mentioned and they find their fulfillment in verse 34, where Jesus said, these things will happen in your lifetime. This generation will not pass away. And the event of the first century, the most critical event, Mark Lee did such a great job during the overview of the Bible. The key event of the first century was the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Andrew, why don't you put up that slide? This is an artist depiction. You know, we sometimes think, the Romans just went in there and plundered it. This is an artist's description of the size and the magnitude of the walls of Jerusalem and the temple. And historians have kind of seen this artwork as probably among the most accurate of what it must have looked like. The Romans totally destroyed Jerusalem. That's why Jesus, thanks Andrew, that's why Jesus says to the Christians, flee, get out of there. And the Christians did. Get out of there. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jewish inhabitants were slaughtered by the Romans. They were starved for months in a siege. And then Titus, the Roman general, had enough, and when they were sufficiently weakened, barged through the walls, destroyed the walls, to the point where the only thing that's left is the western wall of the temple. That massive structure, only what is left is the western wall today. And so that was just obliterated and destroyed, and the Jews scattered throughout the far-flung corners of the empire. So brutal was that destruction. And so when you read that and very few debates, that's what Jesus is referring to. Only the guys that see this futuristic scenario. The clear meaning of the text must mean that Jesus was talking about something that would happen in their lifetime, and that event, the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem, by and large, happened in AD 70. In AD 70. So, everything then that goes before then starts to make sense. Jesus says, don't get hung up on all the signs and things that you see happening. You will be persecuted because of me. The Christians were persecuted by the Jews. There will be false prophets. There were false messiahs that rose up just after Jesus. All of that happened. When you see now, the abomination that causes desolation. Now, and there's a reference to Daniel. So Daniel, all the end time guys go, no, it's this big antichrist at the end of time. Daniel was talking, firstly, about a ruler that would rise up. He came as part of the Greek Empire, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who absolutely hated the Jews and marched into the temple. Legend has it that he sacrificed a pig, which of course would have been embarrassing, and destroyed part of the temple and persecuted the Jews. And so when you read Daniel, you see that there's an immediate future prophetic reference, and then there is a foreshadowing then of a figure in history that we know from the New Testament, an Antichrist figure that will rise. Who might do something like Antiochus Epiphanes, but he was a type of somebody who would stand against the people of God, who would desecrate the place of worship, and so on. So that's referred to then. Who was the abomination referred to here? It must have been Titus. It must have been Titus who marched into the temple and desecrated the temple. And of course, for the Jews, the unbelieving Jews who are not following Jesus, obviously, the temple was that was the pinnacle of worship. Even in Jesus' time, we know it had been used for commercial use and so on. The Ark of the Covenant had long been lost, but still they had this form of religion centered around the temple. So to destroy the temple was like a destruction of the very core of Jewish faith at the time. And that's what the Romans did. It doesn't make sense if you stick it all out into the future, because then Jesus says, flee. When you see that happening, get out of there. Get out of there, because the destruction is coming. And that destruction came. So it goes on. What is particularly tricky, if you go down to verse 29, verse 29 says, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky, heavenly bodies. There will be a sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Now, guys that argue it's the future go to that and say, you see, that hasn't happened yet. That didn't happen around the fall of Jerusalem. You've got to understand that those references are not to be taken literally. How do we know that? Well, because that little phrase in verse 29, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky. Stars don't fall from the sky. In physics, it's impossible. We know that. That reference is found, if you have a footnote in your Bible, you'll find that reference in Isaiah. Let me just give it to you. Isaiah 13, verse 10. It's the exact same reference. Isaiah 13, verse 10 is talking about the fall of Babylon. So why is it referred to here? It's referred to in this sense. It's used in Amos, it's used for the fall of Edom, because it's a metaphor that the Jewish writers used, like this cosmic event of the sun losing its light and stars being scattered, like this cosmic event, God acting in history that would bring about a change on the earth. That's what it meant. That's what Jewish writers understood that. So if you and I, 2,000 years later, just go, oh my gosh, and we take it literally, the sun will be darkened, it's not going to make sense. Stars don't fall from the sky. It's a metaphor. And the metaphor is that there's a cosmic shift that is coming. That God is intervening in human history, as he did in Isaiah, the Isaiah reference, Isaiah 13, to destroy Babylon, in the Amos reference to destroy Edom. And here, God is bringing the end of an epoch where the temple would finally be destroyed, and the end of the now obsolete temple worship. Because the Messiah had come. Because the Messiah had come. And so it goes on then. These signs that appear in the sky are all these kind of apocalyptic. Daniel uses it, Zechariah uses it. Obviously, Revelation is full of it. And they're symbolic. It's almost like fantasy. When you read Revelation, like beast with 10 horns and all this, it's like fantasy. And it was a deliberate style of writing, I've told you this before, that was prevalent in the time of the persecution of the Jews. In fact, it started around about the time of the Maccabees, when Antiochus Epiphanes came in and destroyed the temple. And the Jews were persecuted, and they had this kind of this symbolic, very metaphorical type writing that spoke of God delivering his people, God coming in on behalf of his people. So that's why Revelation's full of it. All these echoes from the Old Testament, and God acted on behalf of his people throughout history. So I know we don't want to press it too far, but Jesus summarizes the whole thing when he says that this generation will not pass away until all these things. Does it make sense? So Jesus takes the first part of Matthew 24 to answer the disciples' question, the first part of their question. When will this take place? When will the temple become obsolete? When will this destruction happen? And Jesus answers that. And so when you've heard all of this said is now still future, understand the weight of those that have unpacked the scriptures hold to that being fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Then Jesus goes on in verse 36. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels, nor the Son of Man, but only the Father, as in the days of Noah. So now, Jesus clearly shifts to the second part of their question. What will be the signs of the end of the age? What will be the signs of the end of the age? And so there's a shift now to what is still to come. Some interesting things here. Jesus firstly says, no one knows about the day or the hour. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And Jesus says that there are no major significant signs. In fact, in theological circles, when you look at end time, that kind of thing, the teaching of the New Testament is that the coming of Christ is imminent. Imminence means it can happen at any time. At any time. There are no whole things of hoops that the world has to go through and jump through before Jesus can return. Jesus can come at any time. There may well be signs. I know that, if you look at there may be this world ruler. The Bible doesn't say there has to be. There may be a world ruler. And every age, by the way, every age has found the Antichrist. If you lived in the Second World War, who was the Antichrist? Hitler would have been the Antichrist. The writings at the time, he was the Antichrist. Stalin was the Antichrist. It's come and gone. Osama bin Laden was the Antichrist. Come and gone. So is there the Antichrist? I don't know. Could there be an Antichrist? Absolutely. Just as there's been many Antichrists, like Antiochus Epiphanes, like Titus. So it could happen any time. It says that not even the Son. Now, obviously, Jesus is speaking on earth. Could it be that he's speaking as the Son of Man? You do not know the hour, because obviously, as Jesus on earth, he had surrendered voluntarily his divinity, part of his divinity, like he's all-knowing and so on. So there's a theological, either way, doesn't really matter. We're not going to get hung up about it. The Father knows. And there'll be a time where God says, now. And Jesus returns. And then there's a clue. There's a clue. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people eating, drinking, Noah warned them, they carried on. You built an ark, how stupid. And they carried on doing whatever they were doing up until Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen. Verse 39, until the flood came and took them all away. Where did they get taken to? Taken away in the flood? To judgment. They weren't taken away to God. God was protecting his own, Noah, and his believing family. So the rest were taken away, swept to judgment. Then it goes on to say, this is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. You see, you've been told that this is the rapture. Now, I've long given up fighting with people that believe the rapture. If you believe the rapture, you can. Just understand it's based on very flimsy theology. That's honest. The secrets come in where Jesus is going to suck his people out, and then there's going to be this tribulation, that kind of thing. So there's this like 2 parts coming. He comes for the rapture, and then we're all up in heaven while everything happens on the earth, and then he comes again. I can give you the history, and we don't have time because we do want to end with prayer today. So let me bring this to a close. So that whole rapture thing has only come around the last, say, 150 years, and so on. For the bulk of Christian teaching down through the ages has been 1 second coming. 1 second coming. Unfortunately, so 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 17 is the key passage. I don't see anything secret about it. The clear meaning of the text is Jesus is coming. And then the other passage is this one. You see, there'll be 2 people in the field. One will be sucked out. It's drama. One will be sucked out. If you watch the Left Behind series, the bus driver is a Christian, worshiping playing his music, he's out of there. Bus crashes. And there's nothing in Scripture that clearly teaches that. You've got to kind of infer it, maybe, sort of, and put it all together. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm just going to tell you that it's based on flimsy theology. It's based on flimsy theology, and I'll tell you why. Jesus just gave us a clue. He just said that in the days of Noah, they didn't understand. Noah was protected, and the rest were taken away, swept away in the flood. Then Jesus says, this is exactly how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken, not to be with the Lord, taken to judgment, if you're going to follow the clear, plain meaning of the text. How do you read it? The one who remains will be the one. If you're going to, I don't think we should read too much into it, but if we're going to try and understand the flow of what Jesus is saying. And why would that necessarily have to be something secret, some rapture? Could it not just be at the coming of the Son of Man? Because the moment that Jesus appears in the sky, those who are for him, those who follow him, all of us will recognize it immediately. there will be Jesus, like it says, in the twinkling of an eye. And those who don't will also. So there's not going to be like negotiation. Who goes, are you in the bus? I don't know. No. 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 The moment the Son of Man appears, the moment he appears, that's it. Human history comes to a grinding halt. Those who are with him are with him. Those who aren't. I don't know whether I'm going or I'm staying. I'm just with him. I know I'm with him. All right. So we don't want to get caught up in all this. I don't know if it's helpful. And here's how Jesus ends this. And this is the most important. This is the most important. He ends with a little parable. Suppose a master left, went away, Jesus. He said he was coming back, but he was long in coming. There are two things that God calls us to in this passage. This is the crux. This is what Jesus wants us to know. This is what he emphasized. Don't run after, and could this be and all the rest. Here's what really matters. Number one, be ready. 5 times from verse 37 to verse 45. 5 times Jesus says, keep watch. From there, he goes on in chapter 25. He talks about the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 had their lamps ready, 5 didn't. So the point is, guys, don't get hung up about who, what. I don't mind if you're interested in that. Read up about it. That's fine. But understand this. The most important thing is be ready because he could come tomorrow. And if he did come tomorrow, are you ready? That is what Jesus wants you to know. Everything that I've said, you can disagree with me. You can put it on the side. You can be confused. Don't be confused. But understand this. What the word of the Lord would be to you today. Are you ready if he came tomorrow? Are you ready? Because the tragedy is, the implication is, many won't be. Many won't be. They'll be living their lives. It's not that we say, oh, well, I've got my whole life to live. But it's just how we live. We don't say it. But we run after all the things of the world, acting like, that's in the distant time. I'll get ready one day, later, get my stuff together. But right now, I've got to build my career and all this thing. Are we ready? Are we ready? And if there's unfinished business that we need to deal with the Lord, with somebody else, deal with it. Deal with it. God emphasizes it because it's important. And then he goes on to tell this parable about 2 different servants, or maybe one servant, depending. The master goes away. Are you going to be like the servant who carried on serving, doing what the master had asked him to do, even though days rolled into months, months rolled into years, and the master's return was long in coming? Or did you go, I don't know, he's not coming. I'm just going to go back to my old ways, do what I used to do. So the challenge of this morning is this. And I hope, has that helped you a bit? Has that helped you? When you understand Matthew 24, which is a key passage that they go to with end times and that kind of thing, half the passage has already been fulfilled. And there are still things that will be fulfilled. But here's the bottom line. Jesus is coming again. And there's a lot of debate, by the way. So I've tried to be as honest with you in terms of what the majority of scholars understand these scriptures to mean. But I do understand there's a whole, with very popular, great following guys, end time stuff that connect all these signs. Understand this. It takes things that have already happened and puts it into the future that I don't think is fair to the text. And ultimately, it's misleading. It's misleading. But don't get caught up in all of that. Be ready. Keep on serving. Be ready. Keep on serving. Keep living like Jesus will come tomorrow. And if he doesn't come tomorrow, keep serving. Keep living your life to the full because he might come on Tuesday. If he doesn't come on Tuesday, you keep serving. Keep doing what you're doing so that you are ready when he comes. Amen? All right. Was that helpful?